Hi, friends. These are difficult times for us, but so that we didn't lose a whole lot of traction in our study together as we looked at Old Testament stories, I encourage you to take some time this morning and we're going to look, or whenever you happen to be viewing this, and we're going to look at a couple of passages. First from Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 22, and then later on we're going to look at a chapter from the book of Leviticus. So let me just preface this today by saying in the Old Testament that God's presence and God's elusiveness are often in tension. And I'll also make apologies now. I'm looking down at my notes, so if I'm not looking directly at the camera, that's what that's all about. But you'll find in this story from Genesis 28 that Jacob discovers that God cannot be controlled, that the curtain between the heavens and the earth can be ripped in two, and sometimes in unexpected ways. God can show up anywhere when you least expect it and aren't ready. So pause your video now and read Genesis 28, 10 through 22, and then we'll pick it up from there. Okay, you might have noticed in verse 11 that it seems like Jacob is forced to stop for the night at what the text says is a certain place. So, a couple of questions around that. Do we see this as an accidental thing or on purpose? And why? Why this particular place? And how we answer this question may make a difference in what we think happens in the rest of the story. So, think about that for a moment. If you happen to be viewing this video with somebody else, there's just some questions you can just pause when you need to and discuss with one another, or just pause it and think on your own, or just move on through it. That's whichever way you want to do that. And a more personal question here is, have we ever been forced to do something that seemed upon reflection to have been, quote, meant to happen? And if so, when was that? And how might that have affected us? Do some reflection on that as a way of moving us into this story. So perhaps you might want to discuss also, why was Jacob's dream in this chapter so important in his spiritual development? As we move ahead in verse 17, a couple of questions in relation to that. Why was Jacob afraid, do you think? And would our response in this situation be the same, do you think, or might it be different? And why do you think that? What does that tell us about ourselves? And how do you feel about that and why? Again, I encourage you to pause the video and have some reflection upon that and perhaps discussion if you're with a partner. So in this passage, Jacob creates a pillar of stones to be a kind of residence for God. And at the same time, he wants God to go with him. So much of human life is reflected in Jacob's dilemma, where he's torn between wanting a God who is free and one who will stay in one place. And this kind of duality between wanting a God who's free and one who will stay in place is also seen later in the transition from tabernacle to temple. Tabernacle being a kind of more mobile God, and then the temple reflecting a God who gets kind of settled in a particular residence, so to speak, in one place. So we see this movement from an impermanent structure where God's Spirit dwelled in the desert and the more ornate building constructed in Israel's new home in Jerusalem. And maybe we can empathize even with that kind of dual longing, because if we mark and claim a space, sometimes we think maybe God will stay put and we'll be able to find God there whenever we want to. If we set down a rock and give it a name, then we'll know where to find God when we need God. But often it's a rude awakening to discover that God thwarts our plans to keep God contained. You might remember that at the dedication of the temple, Solomon talks about God showing up like a thick, dark cloud. And when God shows up like that, it's usually to remind people that God isn't another object to be harnessed or controlled. As we come back to our text in Genesis 28 in verses 20 through 22, Jacob makes a vow and includes several conditions in that. So as you think about that, what is our impression of that vow? In other words, does it seem reasonable or unreasonable? Does it seem legitimate or illegitimate? Sincere or cynical? What gives you the impression that you have in that? What difference does it make how we hear this story, how we hear this vow. And then reflect on what the story tells us about the way God operates in our human lives, in particular, given what we know about Jacob's character up to this point in the story, how we feel about that, and whether we have anything to learn from our reactions to the story. And then the next question would be, how much of God's promise that we see in verses 13 through 15 is also God's promise to you? And again, some things to reflect on. So you may pause the video and have some time to think about those questions.